We're going to be talking about the narrative of victimization as has been played out by right-wingers, particularly the intellectual dark web, in the last few years. So we're going to be talking about fascists, and in particular we'll be talking about the British Union of Fascists, which will be used to give some historical context to this sort of strategy. To compare this to the strategies employed by the IDW, we'll take a look at some of Jordan Peterson's work. We'll look at the initial controversy that surrounded Peterson's opposition to Canada's Bill C-16, as well as Peterson's views on women in the workplace, and see if we can spot any parallels. The British Union of Fascists, or BUF, was formed in the United Kingdom in 1932. The party was founded by Oswald Mosley, who had previously been both a Conservative MP and also served as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in Ramsay MacDonald's National Labour government. Here is a picture of Oswald Mosley on the cover of Time magazine with a caption that reads, "Britain's Hitler." His tenure in the government was short-lived, and having assumed the office in June of 1929, he resigned in May of 1930 after the cabinet rebuffed his plans for the economy. After resigning from office and from the Labour Party, Mosley founded the very creatively named New Party. The point of the New Party was to form a British equivalent of what Mosley called the modern movements, which were emerging in Europe in the wake of the First World War. Mosley saw the New Party as a vehicle for implementing the economic proposals that he had been developing and promoting during his time in the Labour Party. An interesting development of Mosley's fascism came on the 20th of September 1931, when Mosley visited Glasgow, and on Glasgow Green spoke for an hour to a crowd that was reported by the Times newspaper to have been anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 strong. Towards the end of the speech, communists in the crowd started to heckle Mosley and his new party with shouts of traitor and by singing songs like the Red Flag. A note had earlier been passed to Mosley that the communists in the crowd were armed with razor blades. In response to this and the heckling, Mosley, along with his bodyguards, stepped into the crowd and moved towards the people that he thought were the main group of hecklers. What followed was a lot of violence and fighting, with Mosley himself being hit with a stone before escaping the crowd. In response to this event, Mosley had this to say: "This forces us to be fascist. We need no longer hesitate to create our trained and disciplined force." This was a pivotal moment in the transformation of the new party into the BUF. Now, around roughly the same time, the National Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald collapsed following a budget crisis. This led to a general election being held on the 27th of October 1931, just 37 days after the physical clash between the new party and the communists in Glasgow. The new party received just 36,377 votes, winning 0 seats. For context, the Labour Party received roughly 6 million votes, resulting in 46 seats, and the Conservative Party received roughly 11 million votes, resulting in 470 seats, because first past the post is an awesome voting system. This poor performance in the election pretty much spelled the end of the party in its current form, but Mosley wasn't done yet. In 1932, he travelled to Italy in order to study the modern movements that he liked so much in Europe. While there, he even met with fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. When Mosley returned from Europe, he started the BUF. Where the new party had flirted with the ideas of fascism, the BUF fully embraced it to the point that it was actually the name of the party. Mosley had created the Black Shirts, the paramilitary wing of the party, whose function was similar to Mussolini's Black Shirts and Hitler's Brown Shirts. It was at this time that he also began to pull the party in a more anti-Semitic direction. There are 2 more notable events that are relevant to our discussion here. The first was a BUF rally held at the Olympia Exhibition Centre in London on the 7th of June 1943. Again, this event was disrupted, mainly by communists, but also by others. The violence and beatings that occurred during this event were so bad that it was even discussed in Parliament several days later. Up to this point, the party had been funded by Lord Rothermere, who was a well-known Nazi sympathiser, personal friend of both Hitler and Mussolini, and co-founder of the Daily Mail newspaper. Rothermere aided Mosley by providing both funding and favourable news coverage, such as this headline, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts." It's good to see that the Daily Mail's editorial standards have not slipped much in the last 90 years. Rothermere removed his support following the events of the Olympia rally, reportedly because Jewish advertisers had threatened to break with the paper due to his support for Mosley and the BUF. The lack of financial support left the party unable to contest the 1935 general election. The second event of interest occurred in October of 1936, when the BUF organised a march through the East End of London. The East End was chosen by Mosley due to its large Jewish population. This was part of a broader strategy designed to bring the BUF into direct conflict with the Jewish population and to bring about violence which could then be blamed on Jewish instigators, in the same way that Mosley had been able to capitalize on the violent attacks of the communists, who had already had a reputation for breaking up meetings of both right and left-wing parties. The march became known as the Battle of Cable Street, when the BUF met resistance from a large number of anti-fascist protesters. In the aftermath of this event, BUF membership increased threefold, as Mosley was able to connect with anti-Semites by framing himself and the BUF as victims of Jewish aggression. In fascist movements, anti-Semitism is generally promoted not as a core belief, but as a justifiable reaction forced upon them by the actions of Jews. They also justify the use of violence by framing it as a self-defense against communist instigators. The BUF eventually came to an end in 1940, when it was banned by the government due to it being highly sympathetic to an enemy of the state, Nazi Germany. The narrative of victimization is an intentional strategy designed to mobilize people that already agree with you, and to encourage people who somewhat agree with you into holding a more radical position. Radical positions make more sense when your side is under attack. The more desperate the situation seems, the more zealous you need to become in order to fend off the attack. We can see the same narrative of victimization playing out on the right today. As I see it, this narrative is being played out in two different ways by two different groups. The first is the often physical clashes between far-right groups like those led by Richard Spencer and anti-fascist groups like Antifa. The second is a largely intellectual movement and is exemplified by right-wing YouTube personalities and the members of the intellectual dark web in their crusade against social justice warriors. I'm not going to focus on the cases of far-right groups for whom the direct comparisons between the BUF or the Nazis are fairly self-evident. Instead, I would like to focus on the IDW, where I believe parallels exist, but are more subtle and harder to spot. Now, I'd like to note here that the point of this video is not to specifically link these groups with Mosley, or to directly compare the specific policies of the two groups. My objective here is to highlight what I see as highly dishonest and insidious tactics, not so much to comment on the agendas that these tactics are employed to promote. My motivation for doing this is not because I believe all members of the IDW are fascists, but because I believe it is important for everyone to be aware and suspicious when anybody employs these tactics. To this end, I want to take a look at an example video clip of Jordan Peterson surrounded by students during a protest. What I'm interested to analyse here is how being framed as a victim can affect those who watch the video. To do this, I'd like to think about the hypothetical reactions that three people could have to this clip depending on their positions and beliefs prior to watching it. The first person is someone who is pro-trans rights and pro-social justice. This person is likely to come to the clip with pre-existing sympathy for the position of the students and pre-existing suspicion or even hostility towards Peterson. The second person is someone who is anti-trans rights and doesn't like SJWs. This person will have an opposite reaction to that of the first person, that is, they will likely be suspicious of the students and have sympathy for Peterson. Finally, the third person is someone who is fairly agnostic towards the issue of trans rights, like someone who's never thought deeply about the issue either way. We can tie this example to that of core and swing voters in political campaigning in general elections. From the perspective of a politician, your core voters are the people who are definitely going to vote for you. Your opponent's core voters are the people who are definitely not going to vote for you, no matter what your opponent does wrong or what you do right. The swing voters are people who don't live in a fixed political camp. The first two groups are generally full of people who have strongly held political ideologies. The third group are generally more politically agnostic and pragmatic. They will generally vote based on who they think is offering the policies that will most benefit either the country as a whole or themselves individually at the present moment. This, I believe, is why the British Conservative Party has managed to have more years in power than the Labour Party. The Tory party has been able to frame itself as both a Conservative party to appeal to the ideological Conservatives, while simultaneously framing themselves as pragmatists in order to pick up swing voters. I'd imagine that the phrase "a safe pair of hands for the economy" has won the Tories a lot of swing votes over the years. I've lived most of my life in a constituency that is a safe Labour seat, basically a place populated by a large number of Labour Party core voters. I have never in my life had a political campaigner of any party come and knock on my door. Admittedly, I did live at the top of a hill, and maybe my vote just wasn't worth the effort. But even so, I never saw any campaigners in the town anywhere. This is because Labour assumes it'll win, and everybody else assumes Labour will win too. So targeting the constituency is a waste of time and resources for everyone. But somehow they're still surprised when people become disenfranchised. The point of this example is that the party that gets the swing voters wins, so election campaigns for the swing voters, and we can see a similar tactic playing out in this video. By putting himself into opposition with the students, Peterson has got the anti-trans group on his side automatically. It is important to emphasise here that the reasons for his opposition are largely irrelevant to this group. If you already hold anti-trans views, any opposition to trans rights is going to appeal to you. Furthermore, by having himself framed as the victim in the situation, Peterson creates a greater chance of mobilising these people to become even more radical in their beliefs, or more politically active, by creating both an opportunity and a need for them to come to his defence. On the flip side, he automatically turns off the pro-trans people, but that doesn't matter since he was never going to get those people on side anyway. However, by adding in the victimhood framing, he makes it harder for this group to attack him, since doing so will make him look like more of a victim. But what about the third group? The swing voters. Now, this is where the tactics of a Peterson are, in my opinion, superior to that of a Richard Spencer or an Oswald Mosley. The very overt and often violent tactics of Mosley, while they energise a small amount of people with extreme beliefs, they are not particularly good at attracting those in the middle ground. Consequently, while Mosley did have a core of very loyal followers, he was largely unable to translate this into wider national support. The more subtle tactics of Peterson, on the other hand, are far more effective at attracting this group. The first time I saw this clip, I was probably in the swing voter camp. This was the first time I'd heard the issue around pronoun use, and it was also the first time that I'd heard about non-binary genders. When watching the clip, I felt sympathy for Peterson. What I noticed most prominently is that no matter what the students said, or how much I agreed with them, as soon as Peterson started talking about refusing to be compelled to do something, I would quickly be swayed back to his side. Making this a free speech issue is actually a pretty smart move. Notice that whenever the students attempt to talk about being trans, or framing the question in terms of human dignity, Peterson quickly pivots the conversation back to freedom of speech. Peterson is controlling the conversation here by refusing to engage on a topic that he doesn't want to talk about, and instead focuses on a much simpler and more attractive concept of freedom. This does two things. First, it gets rid of the transphobia aspect. Remember back to the example of the BUF. The fascist strategy was to frame anti-Semitism as justifiable reaction to perceived aggressions against them by Jewish people, therefore framing bigotry as patriotism. The point here is to rationalise hatred, bigotry, and prejudice. Second, by denying the students the ability to express themselves fully, Peterson can increase their level of frustration and anger, making it more likely that they will say and do things that are irrational and counterproductive. However, there is always a downside to making specious arguments. Being fundamentally bullshit, they are inherently built on weak foundations, and are therefore very easy to knock down once you find the weaknesses. The weakness in Peterson's argument is that it is based entirely on a misinterpretation of Bill C-16, which doesn't do what he thinks it does. As weaknesses go, this one is fairly profound. Several days after this event, there was a debate between Peterson, Brenda Kosman, and Mary Bryson. I was so interested in this that I actually watched it being live streamed at the time. In the time between seeing the video of the protest and watching the debate, I watched the 3 videos of Peterson's that had initially stoked the controversy. I went into the debate on Peterson's side, having not looked into the issue any deeper than watching these videos, all of which presented Peterson as being fairly hard done by. In this debate, I felt that Peterson was roundly defeated. Kosman, a professor of law, basically told him that he'd completely gotten the wrong end of the stick and had completely misinterpreted the law. This meant that his free speech was never in jeopardy, and therefore his arguments to free speech meant nothing at all. The best bit was when she told him you don't get to go to jail, which was a fun jibe at Peterson's attempts to set himself up as a courageous and selfless free speech martyr. After watching this debate, Peterson's free speech argument was, in my opinion, exposed as a cheap facade. Where he'd been able to get away with his specious free speech pivot during the protest, when under the spotlight of reality he quickly crumbled along with his argument. I have provided a link to the text of the law in question, which even goes so far as to offer pre-packaged example defences that can be used against it. There is also a Reddit thread featuring an arrest counter, which has been updated every week for the last 3 years, to count the number of people that have been arrested under this new law. It is still at 0. The second example that I would like to look at is a clip of Peterson talking about women in the workplace on the Joe Rogan Experience in the wake of the Me Too movement. I have specifically chosen to look at the Joe Rogan clip, as what he is talking about here is something that caused a lot of controversy when he made the same arguments in a previous interview. I've chosen this clip as Peterson claims he didn't perform well in the previous interview, but since he's willing to double down on the argument here, I feel this one is fair game. In this video, Peterson talks about whether or not sexual displays in the workplace should be allowed. The clip employs two strategies. First is the victim narrative again. This clip is quite funny because throughout, Peterson plays the victim in regard to being misrepresented in the media. Then, at the end of the video, accuses Kathy Newman of Channel 4 of playing the victim card, seeming not to realise that he's been doing the exact same thing for the last 14 minutes. The second strategy is obfuscation. He does this by setting up an alternate cause of sexual harassment in the workplace, and doing so in such a vague and nebulous manner that it is difficult to attack directly. In his arguments, Peterson is trying to shift the burden away from sexual harassers to the people being harassed, and he is doing it in such a way that this burden cannot be met by requiring them to exactly define something that is inherently vague. Here, Peterson sets the boundaries of the continuum as the business suit on one hand and being naked on the other. The business suit is seen as something which is entirely acceptable business attire, while being naked is seen as entirely unacceptable. Now, we can take issue with Peterson's assertion of the fact that the business suit isn't designed to be sexually attractive. This is probably because Peterson does not find men attractive and therefore doesn't see a man in a business suit as sexually attractive at all. What he doesn't seem to realise is that such suits are designed in a way to make the man look slimmer-waisted, broader-shouldered, taller, and generally more physically imposing. The suit is entirely designed to enhance male secondary sexual characteristics. The enhancement of these characteristics is why men who wear a well-fitting suit will often feel better about themselves because it makes them look better. This is exactly the same reason why many women choose to wear makeup and high heels, even in situations where they are not looking to attract a sexual partner. The bottom line here is that makeup and clothing do not imply consent. Just because something looks attractive doesn't mean you necessarily get to play with it. For many right-wingers, who seem to be confused with this concept, just think of it in terms of property rights. If a woman was any other inanimate piece of property, you would have no problem in determining what you can and can't do with that property, given that it belongs to somebody else. So if you just remember that the woman belongs to herself, you should be able to figure it out. Peterson hates to be taken out of context, and he also hates it when people misinterpret what he has said, although he himself does not help the situation by talking in vague terms about very, very complex issues. So, just in case you think that my arguments so far are just liberal bias, let's get a bit more scientific and try and pin down the column of smoke that is a Jordan Peterson argument. To begin, without making any assumptions about what Peterson's motivations are, let's try and define his hypothesis as precisely as we can. We can use some of Peterson's reasoning provided in the Joe Rogan clip to try and generate this hypothesis. Peterson claims that we don't understand the rules about sexual displays in the workplace. He also claims that items of female clothing like high heels and makeup, which are currently considered acceptable in the workplace, constitute a sexual display. He then implies, although he doesn't state it directly, that in constituting a sexual display, such clothing may be contributing to sexual harassment in the workplace. So, from these statements I've come up with the following hypothesis. The way in which women present themselves in the workplace makes a statistically significant contribution to the prevalence of workplace sexual harassment. I think this is a pretty fair representation of Peterson's position. If you don't like it, then feel free to provide a similarly falsifiable hypothesis that you think does a better job, and I'll work with that one instead. For now, this is the best that I can do. To disprove this hypothesis, we just need to find one example where it doesn't hold. To do this, we need to find a workplace where men and women are forced to dress in as identical a manner as possible. Peterson himself has handily provided us with an example of acceptable clothing, the male business suit, which he says is derived from military uniforms. So, let's look at the military, where everyone wears the same uniform and works under strict codes that govern their hairstyles and general appearance. Surely this is the place that, if Peterson's hypothesis is true, we would find no sexual harassment whatsoever. This is a study conducted by the Ministry of Defence and the Equal Opportunities Commission in 2006 into sexual harassment in the British Armed Forces. Here is what the study had to say. Almost 99% of the 9,384 servicewomen who had responded to the survey had been in situations where such behaviours had taken place in the previous 12 months, where such behaviours are sexual harassment. There was a high tolerance for these behaviours, but over half the survey respondents, 52%, sometimes found them offensive. All women spoken to said they felt that they had to draw boundaries around what they found acceptable or not. Too explicit sexual language, details of sexual exploits, and pornography were the behaviours most frequently found offensive. Over 2/3 of survey respondents had also encountered sexual behaviours directed at them personally. Just over 15% of survey respondents reported having a particularly upsetting experience. Sexual assault was cited by 12.7% of survey respondents who had had a particularly upsetting experience. 21% of the perpetrators of these experiences were the individual's line manager, and a further 36% were other personnel senior to the individual. Junior officers were found to be vulnerable, with a much higher percentage of them saying they were harassed by someone junior to them, showing that rank does not always offer protection over age. Now let's compare this with a study of civilian workplaces conducted by the Trades Union Congress in collaboration with the Everyday Sexism Project. This study found the following. More than half, 52%, of all women polled have experience of some form of sexual harassment. 35% of women have heard comments of a sexual nature being made about other women in the workplace. 32% of women have been subject to unwelcome jokes of a sexual nature. 28% of women have been subject to comments of a sexual nature about their body or clothes. Nearly 1/4 of women have experienced unwanted touching. 1/5 of women have experienced unwanted sexual advances. More than 1 in 10 women reported experiencing unwanted sexual touching or attempts to kiss them. In the vast majority of cases, the perpetrator was a male colleague, with nearly 1 in 5 reporting that their direct manager or someone else with direct authority over them was the perpetrator. 4 out of 5 women did not report the sexual harassment to their employer. We can see from these studies that there is a large amount of overlap between the sexual harassment in civilian workplaces and in the military. This casts a large amount of doubt over the truthfulness of the Peterson hypothesis. However, as good scientists, we can attempt to formulate a new hypothesis that better fits with the available data. One thing that sticks out to me in these data is the numbers given in regard to who the perpetrators are, and similarly in the numbers for direct line managers and other more senior personnel. It seems that sexual harassment is not entirely one-directional with regards to gender or sex. It does seem, however, to be more one-directional with regard to the power held by the victim and the perpetrator in the situation where the harassment occurs. People with more power are far more likely to harass those without power. The current skew in favour of male perpetrators is due to men, on average, having more power than women within the workplace. So with my hypothesis, I would predict that as women gain more power in the workplace, the distribution of the sexes of perpetrators and victims will move more into line with the distribution of sexes in the workplace. However, in the MOD study, it was shown that higher percentages of female junior officers were being sexually harassed by male subordinates. So, clearly, the power structure is not the be-all and end-all, but I would imagine that this has a far greater effect on sexual harassment in the workplace than makeup and high heels. So, to conclude this video, I'd like to go back once again to a BOF example. In his book The Greater Britain, which was originally published in April of 1934, Oswald Mosley has this to say on the link between fascism and dictatorship. It is customary to describe fascism as dictatorship, a term which leads to some confusion of thought. Fascism is not dictatorship in the old sense of that word, which implies government against the will of the people. Fascism is dictatorship in the modern sense of the word, which implies government armed by the people with power to solve problems which the people are determined to overcome. Modern dictatorship implements the will of the people to action, which cannot be implemented without the power of action being entrusted to the government. In this sense, we accept the word dictatorship, but we do not accept it in the sense implied by our opponents. By dictatorship, we mean leadership. By dictatorship, they mean tyranny. Fascism is leadership of the people with their willing consent along the path of action which they have long desired. Leadership is a term which cannot be misrepresented or misunderstood, and for that reason we prefer to use it. This is literally gibberish. And this kind of obfuscation is another tool that Peterson employs regularly. Trying to figure out Peterson's point when he is talking is half the battle in having an argument with him. In addition to framing the situation as an attack on free speech, or framing himself as a victim of media bias, he also uses these obfuscation techniques to generate specious arguments that at first glance seem difficult to argue against. I would like to reiterate my earlier assertion that I am not calling Peterson or other members of the IDW fascists, but with that said, some of them sure do seem to enjoy using similar techniques of rhetoric and argumentation, and while not fascist, it should still be treated with suspicion and not taken at face value. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.